So here at Seattle Atheist Church, the members ourselves give many of the talks. We have planning meetings every quarter that are open to the whole community. That means you, if you're here, you're part of our community. And we brainstorm ideas for talks we want to give, and then vote on the ideas. So today, join me in welcoming Bruce, who's going to talk about cooperative argumentation and the 10 steps of an argument. All right, Bruce, you have the floor.
Thanks. Thanks very much. That song is a nice introduction to what I'm going to talk about. So what I'm going to begin with is talking about the difference between cooperative argumentation and competitive argumentation. And I've studied this subject for probably about 20 years since I did a class in critical thinking. And it always bothered me how the whole tradition of rhetoric and debate is based on competitiveness. And that was not my experience in a lot of arguments. So I was glad to know that there was a part of a feminist movement within argumentation to try to show that all arguments or all argumentation was not competitive. So what I'd like to start out is just kind of comparing a little bit cooperative argumentation to competitive, and then I'll go through the 10 steps of argumentation that that cooperative argumentation would support. So the first difference is that competitive argumentation is based on the idea of winning and losing. So one person wins an argument, the other person loses the argument. Cooperative argumentation is framed within a win-win situation. So the idea is not to have somebody claim victory, but in some way that when you're arguing, you actually create new knowledge that neither individual had before they went into the argument in the first place. The second difference is in the place of conflict. Conflict in competitive argumentation seems to sound like it's destruction, whereas in cooperative argumentation, conflict is understood as constructive, and somehow through a conflict of opinions, that something new happens and that there's some creativity that comes out of a kind of a synthesis of the two different results. So another way that these are different from each other is that in competitive argumentation, it's the people that are arguing are seen as independent of each other. In cooperative argumentation, it's assumed that people are interdependent. In other words, they have to work together because of some sort of necessity. And there's no getting away from the fact that you have to work something out. In competitive argumentation, arguers are seen as rivals, whereas in cooperative argumentation, the people arguing are seen as resources for each other. And then the last difference is the attitude towards the other person. When you're arguing cooperatively, you're able to get in the other person's shoes and imagine things from their perspective. In competitive argumentation, it's almost like there's kind of a kind of begrudging acknowledgement after the fact that people might have a point, rather than starting with sympathy towards the other person. So the last thing I want to mention about this is that what I'm going to tell you about, it may sound like, well, what you're really arguing for is kind of a compromise, like one person makes a claim and grounds and all that kind of stuff, then the other person does. And what I'm suggesting, you might think, would be simply meeting in the middle in some kind of a compromise. Cooperative argumentation is not like that. Cooperative argumentation sees the two sides as kind of if you know, like the book Flatland, the science fiction book, the two sides may be seen as flatland, but then when you create a synthesis of the 2 points of view, it's like you're going to another dimension, into spaceland. So the new knowledge is more than what either side came up with. So that doesn't mean that when you're arguing, you back down, or you don't give the full thrust of your argument. It just means that you're willing to listen to the other side enough to be able to allow to reflect and change your mind in the process of arguing. What I will do is in our private Facebook group, I'll give you a couple of references for this. There is a book that was written about 2001. It's called Cooperative Argumentation. It was written by two women, and it's a terrific book, and I used it for a number of years in my critical thinking class. I want to make one last point about this. Let me see. No, it'll come back to me. I just lost my train of thought. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to give you a 10-step system for making cooperative arguments. And this is based on, the heart of this is based on an argumentation philosopher that I've mentioned to you before from my other talks. His name is Stephen Toulmin, Toulmin. And he developed a 10-step process of argumentation. And what I've done is taken his 10 steps and I've broadened it out a little bit to 10 based on other argumentation people. So what I'm going to do is give you the 10 steps. If you want to write it down, great. If not, you can always email me and I can send you the 10 steps. Okay, so the first of the 10 steps is to ask the question and answer the question, what is the controversy? That's the first thing. So the first thing you have to do is form a question that is controversial, that your claim is trying to answer. So before you state your claim, you state, what is the framework for having this discussion? Now, unfortunately, in a lot of critical thinking texts, they have maybe a companion book which says something like arguing two sides. And the problem is, if you're really using argumentation, there's always more to two sides. If you look at, say, a field like sociology, there's really about 6 schools of sociology. So there's kind of 6 points of view about a topic. The same thing is true in psychology. You have roughly 6 theoretical schools. It's similarly true in history as well. So the idea when you're stating the issue or the controversy is you want to state it in such a way that it maximizes all the different points of view. And that's not an easy thing to do. I mean, there's some of this stuff in the steps of argumentation, some of the steps are very, very brief, but there's a lot of work that has to go into it. And this is one of the steps. So state the controversy. The second step is to state what your claim is. And in other words, your claim is an answer to one of the 5 or 6 possibilities in the controversy. So you want to state the claim and you want to state it clearly and in a positive way so people know where you're coming from. A good test to know whether you stated the controversy well is you state it in such a way that's so neutral that people cannot guess what your claim is. If you've done that, you've really stated it fairly. If people can tell from the way you frame the issues what your answer is, it means you've excluded positions. So stating the claim is relatively straightforward. The third thing to do is to present what's called a briefing. And a briefing gives you what is the problem that you're trying to solve? Like, what is the ill that you're trying to resolve? What's the cause of the problem to begin with? When and where does it happen most? What power resources are at base? So in other words, after you state the claim, you're trying to give a briefing or the parameters around the problem, which includes the history of the problem, why it's a problem, why if we don't solve it, bad things will happen. It gives it states the parameters of what the argument is. The fourth step in the argument is to clarify meaning. Clarify meaning. Usually in a claim or in an issue, there is usually a word or two that is easily misunderstood. So if you have, for example, you want to make a claim about certain types of religion are superstitious, and you want to say, for example, fundamentalist religion is more superstitious than, say, liberal religion. Well, the problem is you have to define the word superstition clearly. Otherwise, you wind up talking about apples and oranges. So superstition needs to be defined in this case. If you're going to make an argument for or against pornography, you can't start just talking about it. You have to say, what do you mean by the term? So the idea is that people have a sense of where you're going with this and what do you mean by this. So this is the point that if you do it right, whatever the argument is, you'll be talking about apples and apples, not apples and oranges. Otherwise, typically when people don't define the terms, they go through half an hour, 45 minutes of argument before they realize, oh, we're really talking about different things. If you define your term clearly, and usually there's one word in the claim that probably needs to be explicitly defined. Maybe there's a word in the issue that needs work. So you have to define your terms before you begin, but not all your terms. Otherwise, you'd never get off the ground, but just the terms that you think would easily be misunderstood. Okay, so the fifth of 10 has three parts to it. What they all have in common is that they're all supports for your claim. Now you get to the point where once you've stated what your claim is, you define what you need, what it means, the next thing you have to do is support what your claim is. Now, there's three kinds of supports. The first kind of support is usually what people, when I gave my talk on rhetoric a while back, I said, Aristotle said in a rhetorical triangle, when you give support, it should be three parts. It should be logos, which is the facts and statistics. Then there was ethos, which is what are your sources for the facts? And then there's pathos, which is your emotional reaction to things. How do you use your imagination to win an argument? So the idea is the best kind of evidence contains a equal proportion of logos, ethos, and pathos. Okay, now I'm going to give you two other forms of support that are not easy to understand. Usually in an argumentation class, it takes probably 3 weeks for people to kind of get what this is. So if this is not crystal clear, you're not on the wrong page, because it's a little bit more difficult to understand. But the second form of support is something that Toulmin calls a warrant, W-A-R-R-A-N-T. A warrant is the principles or the bridges between the claim and the evidence. So for example, if I say to you, Joe shouldn't be the committee chair, that's the claim. And then I answer it by saying, well, why? He's too bossy. So bossy is the evidence for the claim. The warrant is the underlying principle that says that bossy people should not be committee chairs. That's sort of the underlying assumption that you're making. But if you're a good arguer, you might take exception to that. And you might say, there are some conditions in which bossy people work, right? So it's important to know what your warrant is, because the warrants potentially can be things that your opposition can use to undermine your argument. So the more you know about what your warrant is, the better. Let me give you one more example. One time I was down at the Stanford Rodin Gardens years ago, and I was drawing some of the sculptures there. And a girlfriend of mine saw where I parked my car, and she said, "You're going to get a ticket there. It says right on the meter, they're here from 8 to 5. Her warrant was that they patrol and they actually come and enforce it every day. That was her warrant. But I challenged the warrant, and I said, you know, I've done this for years. They just don't come around, and I've never had a problem with it. So I challenged her warrant. So think of warrant as a kind of underlying philosophy that connects up your claim and the evidence. The third part of support is backing. And backing is the evidence that you have to support your warrant. So the way I like to imagine this, I've done this a couple of times, is I like to imagine an argument as a kind of a house. And the claim and the grounds are kind of like on the first floor. And the warrant and the backing of an argument is like the infrastructure of the house, right? The plumbing of the house. It's kind of like the support that exists underneath the house for the foundation. Now, when most people that I've seen argue that are good arguers is they state their claims good, they do well with that. They're terrific with stating grounds, but they don't examine their warrants and their backing. And so somebody else can come along and say, well, you know, your warrant for this is not really solid. Here's an exception to the rule. So if you know what your warrants are and you can back them up, the more solid your argument will be in terms of relationship to the other people. Okay, so let me switch over. Now, I want you to notice that many of these steps really anticipate who the audience is. And to make a good argument, you have to, as I said at the beginning in cooperative argumentation, you have to imagine who the audience is. So the sixth step is you target your audience. What that means is that you, whether it's a group or whether it's an individual, you put together a profile of those people. What do you think they're going to say? What's significant for them? What are the buzzwords that you should not use with them? What are the stereotypes that they have of you? So in other words, you make a kind of a cheat sheet for yourself, maybe about a half a page, and I've developed like maybe about 10 steps to fill in the argumentation, the audience for the argumentation. This is not something you present in your argument. It's something that you do on your own so that you're prepared for what's going to come back. So the sixth step also has three parts. The first is 6A is like targeting your audience. Who are the people in the room? Who is this individual you're talking about? That sets up step 6B. And 6B is given who your audience is, what objections are they likely to make? So once you have the profile of the people you're arguing with, you have a good material foundation for saying what are their best objections to what you're going to say. And you got to be fair with yourself. You got to put up what their best objections would be. Then on the other side, you'd list maybe 3 objections. I usually like to do this in the form of a T-square. The 3 objections are on the left, and then the step in relationship to that, 6C, is how do you rebut the objections? So it's kind of like as you make your argument, you say to the other person something like, now, I know a little bit about you, and what I can imagine is that you might think this about this subject. You might think this about this subject, and you might think this about this subject. Well, I've got some responses to you. And then you list what the responses are. When you do that, you build credibility among the audience, because what the audience says when you do this kind of work is something like, Jesus, this person has really thought about this and thought about me, because if you've really done your homework, you probably are pretty close in all the objections that they may raise if you've really targeted your audience. And that gives you great credibility because you've tried to put yourself in their places. So that really is very powerful in being persuasive. Okay. The 7th of 10 steps is called point of view. Now, some of you may know this from reading and literature and things like that. The point of view in this argumentation step is what I call sociocultural filters. So your point of view says what your social class is, what your race is, what your age is, your gender, all the sociological categories that you think may limit what you have to say. So the idea is when you state your point of view, you're not making believe you are some sort of independent thinker on the top of a mountain. You're locating what you have to say in your claim based on your class, your age, all the rest of it. And you're saying, now I could be limited in what I'm saying because of these things. That's another way to gain respect, is to say, this is where I'm coming from. Okay, the 8th step is qualification. Qualification is where what you do is you state the exceptional circumstances under which you would withdraw the claim. So you would say, now, here's my claim. However, if these circumstances existed, I would be willing to withdraw my claim. That also shows that you recognize your own limitations. It shows that you're able to say, there are conditions under which this would not apply. And you've already thought about these conditions ahead of time. It's not like you're stumbling and you're discovering them as you argue. The 9th of 10 steps is called prediction. And prediction is, it's very much like, what's his name? Karl Popper said when he talked about falsifiability. Prediction is where you state the limits of your claim by identify the conditions under which you'd be willing to admit you were wrong. So when you're making a prediction, you're saying, if these conditions happen, okay, I'm wrong. But you have to figure out what the conditions are. If you can't state the conditions, then you're not willing to recognize that you could be wrong. Now, an example of this is, of course, I knew nothing about argumentation when I was 9 or 10 years old, but I remember playing ball in the sandlots, and we would always argue before we'd be playing choose-up games, but before and after the games, we would wind up arguing about who the best ball player was. In my time, it was like Hank Aaron, Willie Mays, and Mickey Mantle. So here I am dating myself, but and we would say, yeah, we'd go back and forth and back and forth. But then the point at which the rubber met the road was, we'd say, do you want to make a bet? And the bet would be, okay, so who's going to have the best statistics at the end of this year? So if we're arguing in April, then we're going to bet money on who had the best statistics, and we'd make it. We'd agree on what the criteria was: runs batted in, home runs, batting average, whatever it was, and then in October we would know who won. So it's like our attempt to say, "Do you want to make a bet?" is a way to say you're willing to admit the conditions under which you're willing to be wrong. So prediction is another way of showing limitations, willingness to be wrong, willingness to withdraw. And again, that's a very powerful thing. You gain respect when you're willing to admit limitations. So a good portion of the argument is based on trying to show you're right. But then towards the second half, you're willing to say, there can be extenuating circumstances. I thought about it enough. This is what they are. Okay, the last step, last of 10 steps. This is where you project your claim into the future. What this means is that if you want to convince somebody of something, you've got to have some steps in between what your claim is and what's going to happen in the future. So if you want to persuade somebody, you have to say, if you're willing to go along with my claim, first we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, and then my claim will be realized. So you have to provide steps. So you have to answer questions like, what's the plan? How can this be put into action? What steps would be taken? That would show that you were thinking about practically about what the answer to your claim would be. The second thing you would do is you'd say something about the costs. How much, if this is a project of some kind, how much money would this cost to put into practice? How much time and energy would be put? This is another way of showing people you've really thought about this. And then the last part of the projection is, what are people going to get out of it? Like what tangibly, like if you're willing to go along with this claim, what can the person you're arguing with achieve as a result of listening to you? So that's pretty much it. My sense about this is if people use these steps, the second half of this 10-step program is very sympathetic to the audience. That in turn sets up a willingness to cooperate and go back and forth. So if you soften things and you're rhetorically serious about this, you have a much greater chance of actually having cooperative argumentation instead of competitive argumentation. The last thing I want to say is where could these things happen? Where can, most of the time you see in argumentation books, you see things like you'll see this used in political debates. You may see it in law courts, but that's not the only places that these things can be applied, these steps can be applied. The book talks about, cooperative argumentation talks about community meetings or neighborhood meetings. They also talk about how this can be used in a city council meeting. When we lived in Oakland, there was an organization called Community Democracy, in which they would go to City Hall and they would agitate for something called participatory budgeting, which involved the actual people in the neighborhood in city planning. So you can use these argumentation steps in those settings as well. You can certainly use this certainly in one-on-one situations, but it can also be used in a collective setting in communities. So there you have it.
Thank you, Bruce. Can everyone please unmute their microphones and give Bruce a round of applause? All right. So